I think we shouldn't get hung up on the title. It simply means Egyptian that's been modified, changed in some way.
Actually, there are several Egyptian scripts. We're all aware of the hieroglyphs, which are the oldest and first texts that the Egyptians wrote in that form, mostly designed to be carved into stone. But there are two cursive versions also. There's hieratic that was used, and then demotic. Demotic is really cursive. Has lots of ligatures, and they made it so one could write it very speedily, very quickly, if one knew that writing style. And it came into use about 800 BC, so that was a couple centuries before Lehi's time.
The Book of Mormon is very clear that the writing system they use has been changed during their stay in the New World. That is, you shouldn't expect to find Old World evidence for it, not for their particular reformation of Egyptian. It's a unique writing system, unique to them, and they say nobody else can understand our language.
Normally what the critics do is they'll go out and they'll ask scholars, Egyptologists usually, do you know anything about Reformed Egyptian script? What is that? And they'll say, well, I've never heard of it. Well, it's natural, because in Mormon chapter 9, Moroni specifically says it was called by them, by the Nephites. They called it Reformed Egyptian. That didn't mean that the Egyptians called it that.
Did Reformed Egyptian exist? Well, the Book of Mormon would be evidence that it does. Is it possible that that Egyptian has been modified in other ways, in other places? Absolutely. Coptic, for example, the language, the liturgical language of the Christian Church in Egypt, is Reformed Egyptian. It's written in a modified Greek alphabet with Egyptian characters. For that matter, you could argue that some of our own letters are Reformed Egyptian in English. The letter M may just be the ears of an owl. In ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, the owl was pronounced M, and now we have this little M thing that's the ears on the top of the owl's head. So are languages modified? Yes. Anyone who's tried to read Beowulf from 1,000 years ago in English, it's English, but it's unreadable unless you've had special training. So the language of the Nephites in isolation for 1,000 years from Jerusalem, probably impacted by languages around it, referring to things that nobody in Palestine had ever seen, is going to change. It changes pronunciation, it changes vocabulary, it changes in innumerable ways. So saying that a language had changed and become a different kind of language is absolutely plausible. And I'd submit that it's even evidence for Joseph Smith's authenticity as a prophet, because he was a very unsophisticated kid. I don't know that he knew that languages change over the course of time.
Language changes in 1,000 years, and the script that goes with it is likely to change at least somewhat to go with it. So we really have no clue what Reformed Egyptian might have been.
The Egyptians and the Israelites were not always enemies. In Lehi's time, in fact, they were friends. The Bible makes this very clear, as a matter of fact.
It's probably an oversimplification to say that the Egyptians and the Hebrews were enemies. They were also on occasion trading partners. They were neighbors. Egyptian was one of the great languages of the period. Hebrew was not. So a person who was engaged in commerce, as Lehi seems to have been, probably would have had to learn the language of the wider world of commerce. And Egyptian was certainly one of those languages.
As it was, the Jews were very friendly with Egypt at that particular time. They may not have been at the time of the Exodus, but they certainly were in Lehi's time.
You may not like the foreign policy of the country that speaks the language, but you may be forced by economic necessity or ambition to learn the language that they speak.
Some have objected that using Egyptian to write holy script, to write texts, religious texts, would be unknown and unheard of among the Israelites, because they would only write in the holy language, which was Hebrew. But actually we do have examples of biblical texts written in Egyptian characters. The earliest of these is from the 4th century BC, so not too terribly long after Lehi's time. It's a text written in Egyptian Demotic, but the words are not Egyptian. The words are Aramaic, but they're not using the Aramaic alphabet, which is the same as the Hebrew. Instead, they're using the Demotic way of writing, and part of that text is Psalm 20.
I'm not sure that there's ever been a time when people haven't been able to translate the languages of the Bible. Greek is still a living language. Hebrew was a living language in a sense among the Jews, even in their diaspora. They used it for liturgical purposes and for writing sacred texts and that kind of thing. And so we've always known Hebrew and Greek.
So the old world languages, as far as being able to read them and translate them, and of course having texts that we could read and translate, have been around thousands and thousands of years.
On the other hand, the languages of Mesoamerica, apart from a few indigenous peoples, essentially died out. And they have to be learned now as learned languages. And the glyphic language, the language of the inscriptions, has to be taught in graduate schools.
Years. The New World is a very different situation. We haven't had very many texts, and dating to anywhere near Book of Mormon times, the texts are really quite rare. We only have relative handful of texts on monumental architecture from the Maya, where they carved the glyphs in stone. Most of those are starting after AD 250. We have indications that they painted some of those earlier, even into 100 BC, and some of them are recent finds like the San Bartolo glyphs. Our ability to read those, probably read, accept, and really make a breakthrough since 1970. Somewhere in the early 70s, people finally dug out the work of Yuri Knorozov, who was a Russian. Did the work that actually cracked the code of the Maya glyphs, but people didn't know it for a long time, didn't want to accept it because he was a Russian. Had he been an American, we might have been much happier about it. But they finally realized he was probably right. Renewal of all kinds of interest in that happened in the early 70s. Since then, there's been an explosion, and more and more glyphs are being read every day. Interestingly enough, however, they're reading the version of the glyphs from AD 250 and later. When they find these glyphic texts from 100 BC, they're finding that although they seem familiar and they might be able to recognize a glyph or two, they can't read those yet. So moving even 300 years back in time with a similar culture, they're finding their ability to read it has gone back to near zero, and we have to start over.